Chris Parker had been working as a security guard in a restaurant for 2 months and actually liked his job. Before that, the man served on a contract with the Marine Corps, so he was used to risking his life for the good of his homeland. Chris was never of a timid kind. Even back in school, the man used to defend the weak and the disadvantaged. When he grew up, defending justice became the #1 mission in his life. At first, it was hard for Chris to get used to civilian life, which was fundamentally different from that in the armed forces. But over time, Chris managed to adapt to his new environment and even got a job at a restaurant. Of course, his new position couldn't be compared to his time in the Marine Corps, where every day was a challenge. But on the other hand, Chris had many duties at the restaurant too. The work of the restaurant security guard could hardly be called easy, and anyone who ever tried to do it knew it very well. Chris's predecessor was fired for his regular absenteeism and tardiness. The former Marine never allowed himself such mishaps. He was very polite, punctual, and diligent. The only thing that made Chris's life miserable was the attitude he got from the manager of the establishment. Alfred Thompson was used to keeping everything under his vigilant control, and therefore he didn't like headstrong employees who had their own take on everything. It was for this very reason that he didn't like Chris at first sight. The most interesting thing was that the young security guard never allowed himself to criticize the restaurant manager or disrespect him in any way. The manager's hostility probably originated at some subconscious level, when one person gets irritated by another for no apparent reason. At the same time, the negative energy that radiated from Alfred wasn't directed only at Chris, but at all the other restaurant employees too. Of course, this upset the young security guard, but he couldn't do anything to change the situation for the better. Moreover, Alfred was the boss, which meant that he could do as he pleased. Everyone else saw Chris as a pretty nice young man and felt that they could rely on him and ask his help in difficult times. Chris's father died in a car accident back when the man was 5 years old, so his mother raised him mostly on her own. Being a one-man woman, Charlotte Parker could never connect her life with someone else's. Chris loved his mother very much and always supported her in everything. Every time her son left for work, Mrs. Parker felt anxious. She knew that her son was young and hot-tempered, and therefore could easily mess things up. On the other hand, she knew that Chris would never touch an innocent person and would always stand up for someone if they were being treated unjustly. After just a month at the job, Chris already knew all the employees of the restaurant. He knew the names of every waiter and kitchen worker. But when Chris came to work that day, he almost immediately saw a new waitress named Nancy. She was a pretty young woman in her mid-20s, with long blonde hair and huge gray eyes that immediately reminded Chris of Bambi. Fluttering between the tables like a butterfly, she served customer after customer with such grace that she immediately earned Chris's respect. Nancy also seemed to be indifferent to tips and didn't see it as a tragedy if someone forgot to tip her. The guard knew that Alfred Thompson took part of the tips for himself, forcing the waitstaff to give him about half the money they got from the grateful customers. Even though it was actually illegal, none of them were in a hurry to complain about the manager. It just didn't make sense to ruin the relationship between their superior, since each of them planned on continuing to work at the restaurant. As usual, Chris stood at his post and carefully watched the establishment. Most of the time, the restaurant was a rather quiet place, so there were rarely any kinds of incidents there. But that day turned out to be completely different. It all started with the fact that a noisy group of drunk young people came to the restaurant. Judging by the car they left in the parking lot, they were very well off. At the sight of these customers, Chris tensed up visibly. In his experience, it was this kind of customer who caused the most problems. Once inside the restaurant, the young people immediately started behaving obnoxiously and bullying the waitstaff. By an ironic twist of fate, it was Nancy who had to serve this trio. Despite the fact that the young men radiated hostility, the waitress approached their table with a pleasant smile on her face and held out the menus. At that moment, one of the men gave her a sleazy look and chuckled. Of course, Nancy understood that it would hardly be possible to serve these people without any incidents, but she still tried her best to smooth out the situation. Chris didn't take his eyes off their table. He was ready to come to Nancy's aid at any moment. and only the manager behaved as if nothing was wrong. Frankly speaking, Alfred didn't care about his waitstaff. All he cared about was his own profits. The owner of the restaurant did know about his tricks, and therefore he honestly believed that everything was great at his establishment. Meanwhile, the young men were getting more crude and caustic in their comments. When Nancy brought over their order, they made disgruntled faces and said that they weren't going to pay for it. Nancy tried to reason with the obnoxious young men, but one of them grabbed her by the hand and virtually dragged her to the table. Chris couldn't stay aside and immediately got involved in the matter. Since the guard didn't look that strong, the young customers didn't see him as a threat. "Check this out, the defender has come," one of the men chuckled. But he didn't have time to continue his monologue because Chris instantly knocked him down. He used the technique that he learned and perfected during hundreds of training sessions in the Marine Corps. Having lost one man, the remaining two didn't feel as cocky anymore. But they pulled themselves together and tried to surround Chris. That didn't help, and the young guard had them both down in the blink of an eye. At the same time, Chris tried to be careful because he understood that the men were drunk and could actually be decent people when sober. Having twisted the arm of one of the young men, Chris quickly led them out onto the street. Then he went back 2 more times and got all of the obnoxious men out. "Well, that's it," Chris said, smiling. "You were so great in there," Nancy exclaimed, adjusting her hair. "Oh, come on, I didn't do anything special." Chris brushed her off and went back to his post. At that moment, the manager came out of his office. The expression on Alfred's face made it clear that he was unhappy with the way the situation unfolded and that the obviously wealthy customers were thrown out of the restaurant. Moreover, he knew that he could end up having problems if those young men had influential parents, since people like that definitely wouldn't be happy with the treatment that their kids got at the restaurant. Meanwhile, the manager didn't care the least bit about the fact that his waitress was mistreated. Neither did he care about Chris. When the manager met the eyes of the former Marine, he immediately got mad. "What do you think you're doing? Are you trying to scare away all my clients? Who's going to come to our restaurant after you did that? I'm not paying you to throw customers out on the street." "But Mr. Thompson, Chris stood up for me. If it weren't for him, the situation could have gotten completely out of hand." Nancy tried to reason with the manager. Alfred Thompson's irritation grew stronger by the minute. The last thing he wanted was for some waitress to try and point out that he was wrong. Frankly, he disliked each of them at first sight, and now he felt that there wouldn't be a better time to fire them. "I see you two have found each other. You know what? You can both get out of here. You're fired. And don't even think about coming for your last paycheck. I will use it to compensate the restaurant for the damages you caused." Alfred snapped, pointing his finger at the door. Chris knew what the manager was doing was completely illegal and that he couldn't fire them without a good reason. But on the other hand, Chris also understood that in this particular situation, there was nothing he could really do, as all the power was in the manager's hands. Having exchanged a meaningful look with Nancy, Chris wandered towards the exit. Losing his job in such an unpleasant way felt like a personal failure to him. Chris went outside and only then realized that Nancy was following him. "You shouldn't have come after me. Maybe he would have let you keep your job," the man said, sadly. "No way, I'm not working with that man for another minute," the woman answered. Since it was already quite late, Chris volunteered to walk Nancy home. The young man wanted to play for time in order to delay seeing his mother, who would definitely ask him about his day at work. However, before they'd gone even a quarter of a mile away from the restaurant, Chris started feeling uncomfortable. It was hard to explain, but Chris sensed that something was wrong. The man felt as if someone was literally drilling into his back with a heavy, attentive gaze. Having turned around, Chris saw that a car with tinted windows was slowly driving down the street. Since it was moving very slowly, the man immediately realized that it was surveillance. "Nancy, I don't know what it is, but I'm pretty sure we're being followed. It could be those guys from the restaurant. In any case, we need to be careful," the young man said. Nancy turned around and did something that Chris least expected. She waved at the driver of the Ford, after which he blinked his headlights back to the waitress. "Do you know this car?" Chris asked in surprise. "Yes, I do," Nancy said evasively. "Who are you?" Chris was genuinely surprised. Nancy smiled mysteriously, but then immediately changed the topic of the conversation. Having realized that Nancy wasn't going to say another word about it, Chris tensed up visibly. The young man didn't like being out of the loop. Since Nancy was about to get into the car, it no longer made sense to walk her home. Having said a dry goodbye, the young man threw his hood over his head and went home. As Chris expected, his mother met him at the door. Charlotte Parker knew her son very well and immediately realized that something was wrong. "Are you in some kind of trouble? Are you having problems at work? You look upset. And you're home early. What happened?" the woman asked anxiously. At the mention of work, Chris grimaced involuntarily, after which he said, "Mom, I got fired, so I don't have a job to have problems at anymore." Mrs. Parker turned pale and took a couple of steps back. "I knew it would happen. I knew he'd get fired," flashed through the woman's head. Nevertheless, she didn't reproach Chris, but simply invited him into the kitchen to have dinner. Since the man wasn't hungry, he just sat there with the bored look on his face and poked around his salad. Then he thanked his mother for the dinner and retired into his room. Unfortunately, the man couldn't seem to fall asleep, thinking about how his keen sense of justice cost him his job. Chris only managed to fall asleep in the morning, when the timid rays of sunlight already touched the windows of his bedroom. However, he wasn't destined to enjoy his sleep, as he was soon awakened by a loud knock on the door. Wondering who it could be, the man opened the door and froze in shock. His surprise was caused by the fact that it was Nancy who came to see him, and she had the same mysterious smile on her face. "Nancy, how did you find me?" the man exclaimed in surprise. "Yes, it's me." "Well, will you let me in, or do you want to talk here?" Nancy asked with a smile. Chris immediately invited the guest inside, after which he began to fuss around in the kitchen, trying to make coffee. Mrs. Parker looked at her son struggle with the smile, but didn't interfere, and then went to her room to let the young people talk. When Chris put a cup of coffee in front of Nancy, the young woman got to the main point of her visit. "How would you feel about getting the position of manager at the restaurant?" "In what restaurant? They kicked me out yesterday, remember?" Chris exclaimed in surprise. Nancy smiled again and replied, "Well, they kicked you out, and now they want you back. There's a lot you don't know. The real owner of the restaurant is my father. I disguised myself as a waitress to do my internship there after graduating from university. That lowlife Alfred didn't even know what an unfortunate mistake he made yesterday." It was only then that Chris realized that Nancy wasn't actually a poor waitress, but a millionaire's daughter. Of course, the former Marine immediately accepted Nancy's offer and was ready to start working right away. Alfred Thompson was fired, and Chris took his place, as promised. Under his leadership, the restaurant reached a new level, which significantly affected its profits. Rumor had it that Nancy and Chris's friendship quickly turned into a romantic relationship, which seemed like it would last a long time. Those who knew this couple personally were sure that they would have many more proud moments in their lives, which they would later tell their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren at the family dinners.